The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon-scented cleaner. Grace Miller stood at the far end, clutching her tote bag with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The office was quiet now. Most people had already left for the day. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly above her head. She hadn't meant to cry at work, but there it was, her mascara smudged, her shoulders stiff from holding everything in. She had just hung up the phone. Not that it mattered who was on the other end. The words were still echoing in her head, sharp and impossible to ignore. "She's not like you, Grace. She actually makes me feel seen." That's what Ryan had said. Her husband of 8 years, her college sweetheart, the man who used to kiss her forehead every morning like it meant something. Now he was in Austin, probably sitting across from the woman he'd chosen instead. Grace didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal or how unsurprised she felt when it happened. She leaned against the wall, staring at the muted office carpet, trying to breathe quietly. She didn't want anyone to see her like this, but then again, no one ever really did. 32 floors below, the city glowed with 1,000 tiny lights. People were heading home, making dinner, laughing over drinks. And here she was, trying to find the courage to walk back into an office where she didn't seem to matter. She whispered into her phone before hanging up, not realizing someone else had just turned the corner behind her. "I don't have anywhere to go, and no one here even knows I exist." Her voice wasn't bitter, just tired, like someone who had spent too many years pretending everything was fine. Around the corner, Ethan Grant stopped mid-step. He hadn't meant to overhear anything. He was on his way back from a late meeting when the sound of that sentence, so quiet and broken, pulled him to a halt. He didn't move, just stood there, hidden by the curve of the hallway, listening to a woman he had barely noticed until now say the kind of thing that didn't belong in a building filled with mission statements and polished ambition. Grace straightened her shoulders, wiped her face, and started walking toward the elevator as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. Ethan didn't follow, he just stood there, something heavy pressing against his chest. The next morning, Grace came in early, as she always did. Her desk was in the far corner near the copier, where no sunlight ever reached. There was no nameplate, no window, just a small stack of paperwork that somehow never stopped growing. She turned on her monitor, sat down, and exhaled slowly. Her hands moved automatically, checking emails, filing reports, typing replies, but her mind was elsewhere. She had slept barely 3 hours. Her eyes were dry, but her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Maybe it was time to leave. Not just the marriage, but the job, the city, the version of herself that spent years trying to be small and useful and agreeable. Maybe she was done with all of that, but for now she opened the drawer to her right and pulled out her old journal. The leather cover was worn and soft at the edges, like something that had been held too tightly for too long. She flipped through the pages. Inside were notes, ideas, sentences that didn't belong in reports or spreadsheets, things she wrote during lunch breaks or late nights when the building had gone quiet. There were letters she'd written, but never sent. Marketing concepts no one had asked for. Stories about clients she'd only seen once in the lobby. Observations, feelings, hopes, tucked away in ink and paper. And on the very first page, written in small, neat handwriting, "I wonder what it feels like to matter to someone, to say something and watch it actually land somewhere." She didn't know that upstairs, far above her forgotten desk, Ethan Grant was sitting in his office, remembering her voice from the night before. Not just the words, but the way she said them, like someone who had gotten used to not being heard. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself wondering, why hadn't he noticed her sooner? The next morning, Grace showed up to work at the same time she always did. Her face looked calm, her clothes as neat as ever, but there was a quiet heaviness behind her eyes that most people wouldn't notice. James did. He didn't say anything about it, just walked by her desk and casually dropped a granola bar in front of her, the kind she always picked from the vending machine. Grace looked up with a faint smile, surprised. James just shrugged and said she looked like she might have skipped breakfast, then walked away before she could answer. It was a small gesture, but in a building where most people barely made eye contact, it felt oddly comforting. At 9 a.m. sharp, the weekly client meeting began. Grace slipped into the boardroom like she always did, quietly, unobtrusively, notebook in hand. She sat at the back corner of the room, her usual spot, ready to take notes. Around the table, the usual voices filled the air. Madison Sharp, head of marketing, was already leading the discussion with her polished tone and dramatic hand gestures. She was talking about the Morrison Group again, their biggest client, the one on the verge of walking away. Madison said their feedback had been disappointing. Apparently, they thought the proposals lacked emotional resonance, felt too robotic, too impersonal. Madison insisted they needed something that struck a balance between professionalism and empathy, something human, but not too sentimental, she added with a forced laugh, as if the very idea of feelings in business was mildly amusing. Grace's heart skipped, that word again, sentimental. The same word Ryan had used not long before telling her he'd found someone else. Grace kept her eyes on her notebook, fingers hovering above the paper. She could feel her pulse in her throat. For weeks now, she'd been quietly drafting new client letters in her spare time. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she cared. Because she saw something everyone else seemed to miss. She'd written from the heart, about trust, about the emotional weight behind partnerships, about how companies were made of people with stories and dreams. And now, listening to Madison say they needed something more authentic, Grace realised this might be her only chance. Before she could talk herself out of it, she raised her hand. It was quiet, hesitant, almost invisible. But Ethan Grant, seated at the far end of the table, noticed it. Madison turned, eyebrows raised, clearly surprised. Grace said she'd been working on a few ideas for the Morrison Group, just in her own time. Nothing formal, just thoughts. The room went quiet. A few people exchanged glances. Then Madison smiled in that perfectly rehearsed way she always did when she was about to dismiss someone. She called it sweet, said it was adorable that Grace had tried to help, but this was serious communication work, not, as she put it, an office birthday card. The soft laughter that followed stung more than Grace expected. She almost dropped her hand, almost folded her notebook shut, but before she could retreat, Ethan spoke. "Let her speak," he said simply. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it changed the entire room. Grace opened her notebook, her voice quiet but firm. She talked about Morrison Group's story, how their founder had started the business after watching his father's company fail. How their brand wasn't just about growth, but redemption. Grace said they weren't just looking for a vendor, they were looking for someone who understood what it meant to believe in something again. The room stayed silent. When the meeting ended, everyone moved on, papers shuffling, chairs pushing back. But Grace stayed behind to clean the coffee cups like she always did. She didn't know Ethan had stayed too. When she turned around, he was beside her, hands in his pockets. He asked her how long she'd been writing those drafts. She told him, a while. He asked why she never shared them. She said because no one ever asked. Ethan looked at her for a long second, then said something so simple it nearly broke her. "I did." And then he walked away, leaving Grace standing there with an empty coffee tray in her hands and a heart that felt both heavier and lighter than it had in a long, long time. The rest of the day passed like fog. Grace went through the motions, answered emails, updated spreadsheets, delivered reports, but her mind kept replaying the moment Ethan said, "I did." It wasn't just the words, it was how he said them. Calm, sure, like he'd meant it for a while. By the time the office emptied out, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across her desk. Most of the staff had already left. The floor grew quiet except for the distant hum of the vending machine and the soft tap of her keyboard. She thought about staying late to finish up the quarterly summary. But truthfully, she just wasn't ready to go home, not to the silence of her apartment, not to the pile of moving boxes still unpacked, or the couch where she'd cried herself to sleep just last week. She opened her journal again, not the digital kind, the old leather one she kept in her bag, the one no one knew about. The page she turned to held the first draft of the letter she had written for Morrison Group. It wasn't fancy, it didn't have metrics or fancy headlines, but it had something else, honesty, humanity, a voice, her voice. She read it over again quietly, like someone rereading a letter they never sent. Then she heard footsteps behind her. James. He smiled like he always did, soft, not intrusive. He held a folder in one hand and a half-empty coffee cup in the other. "Still here?" he asked. Grace nodded. Just finishing up. James hesitated before speaking again. Listen, I wanted to tell you something and I probably should have said it earlier. She looked at him curious, a little nervous. James cleared his throat and held up the folder. You remember that letter you wrote, the one for Morrison Group? I sent it. Grace froze. He kept going. I sent it to my cousin. He works over there in the communications team. I didn't say it was from you or anything. I just told him I found it and thought it might help. He read it, and he forwarded it to his director. Grace blinked, unsure whether to be angry, scared, or something in between. Her voice came out softer than she intended. You sent it without telling me? I know, James said quickly. I should have asked, but it was too good to just sit in a drawer, and they loved it, Grace. They called it the most sincere pitch they've ever read, said it made them feel seen. She stared at the floor, 1,000 thoughts rushing through her head. Fear, hope, doubt. James added, They want to know who wrote it. They're asking for a meeting. Grace's heart skipped. All this time, she'd been invisible, overlooked, pushed into corners. And now someone wanted her voice in the room. But just as quickly, reality crashed in. Madison. Grace remembered how Madison had brushed her off, embarrassed her in the meeting, dismissed her ideas like they were child's play. If Madison found out her assistant had gone behind her back, even unintentionally, it wouldn't just be awkward, it would be war. James must have seen the worry in her face. No one has to know right away, he said gently. I didn't attach your name. I didn't send it from a work email. I just wanted to give your words a chance. Grace didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Later that night, after she finally left the building, Grace stood outside the train station with the letter still open in her hands. She read the last line to herself under the glow of the streetlight. We believe business isn't just about service, it's about trust. And trust begins when someone feels truly seen. She exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, it was time someone saw her too. The next morning, the office felt different. There was a buzz in the air, quiet but charged. The kind of energy people didn't talk about out loud, but still felt under their skin. Grace noticed it the second she stepped off the elevator. People were moving faster, speaking in clipped tones, glancing at their phones more than usual. She walked to her desk, tucked into the far side of the floor near the supply closet, and found her name scribbled in permanent marker on a delivery envelope. Inside was nothing important, just promotional pens from a vendor. But her name in someone's handwriting made her pause. She sat down slowly, her fingers brushing across her keyboard, but her thoughts weren't on the day's tasks. They were stuck on James's words from the night before. They want to know who wrote it. She still hadn't decided whether to be terrified or hopeful. By mid-morning, Ethan sent out a calendar invite. Mandatory meeting, all department leads, 11 sharp. Grace wasn't part of that circle, of course. She wasn't lead anything. But Madison stopped by her desk 10 minutes before the meeting, heels clicking sharply on the tile. You're coming, Madison said, not even waiting for a response. Grace blinked. Me? Madison gave a tight smile that didn't touch her eyes. You've been sitting in on the Morrison notes. You might as well be in the room. Just don't speak unless spoken to. She walked off before Grace could reply. Grace felt her stomach tighten. Something was off. At 11, the conference room filled quickly. Madison, as always, took her usual seat near the front. Ethan entered last, carrying a thin folder in one hand and a black coffee in the other. He didn't sit. Instead, he walked to the end of the table and stood there, silent for a beat longer than usual. Then he spoke, his voice calm, deliberate. We're about to lose the Morrison account. The room stiffened, a few people exchanged nervous looks. They told us our messaging feels cold, mechanical, like we're talking at them, not to them. Ethan opened the folder, pulling out a few printed pages. 3 days ago they received an anonymous letter, no logos, no names, just words. Words that made them feel understood for the first time. He paused. They're requesting a meeting with the author. Madison's posture shifted subtly. She crossed her legs, lifted her chin. We haven't sent any anonymous letters, she said evenly. Ethan looked at her. Apparently someone in this building did, without approval. There was a heavy silence. Grace could feel her pulse in her ears. Madison let out a small, polite laugh. Maybe a junior employee got a little too enthusiastic. These things happen. Ethan's gaze moved across the room, then stopped on Grace. She looked down immediately, pretending to check something in her notebook, but her fingers weren't moving. Madison followed his eyes. When she turned back, her smile had hardened. Actually, Now that you mention it, Grace has been talking about Morrison a lot lately. She's very passionate. The word landed with weight, like an accusation wearing perfume. Grace opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Madison leaned back in her chair. I did receive a call from their office asking about a submission that didn't come through formal channels. I told them I wasn't aware of anything. Her voice was smooth, practiced. And now that we're talking about it, I think we may need to review protocol. It's a serious matter, communicating with clients outside of approved systems. Ethan didn't respond right away. Then he closed the folder, laid it flat on the table and turned to Grace. Did you write it? His tone wasn't angry, just searching. Grace felt every pair of eyes in the room turn to her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the wall, to rewind time and stay quiet forever. But something inside her, something small and tired of being silent, stood up. Yes, she said quietly, I wrote it. The air went still. Madison let out a soft sigh, like someone disappointed but unsurprised. Well, there we have it, she said almost gently. A well-intentioned mistake, but still a breach of policy. But Ethan didn't look away from Grace. He asked, why? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Because the letter Madison sent didn't sound like us. Or them. It sounded like a robot. I thought, maybe we could do better. Ethan nodded slowly. Then he looked around the room. I've been reading Grace's work for the past hour. All of it. Observations, drafts, alternative proposals, things she's been writing for months. He paused. It's the most human thing I've seen come out of this department in a year. Madison stiffened. Ethan, with all due respect, she's not trained in client communication. She's an assistant. No, he said, she's a voice we've been ignoring. And just like that, the room shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but the balance of power tilted ever so slightly. Grace didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt heard. After the meeting, Grace didn't go back to her desk. She didn't feel like she could, not with the eyes that had just stared at her like she'd grown wings or horns. So instead, she walked to the break room and stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee she didn't remember pouring. The city outside looked soft, a little blurred through the glass. Her hands were still shaking, just slightly. She had never spoken like that in a meeting before, never raised her voice in a room full of power. And yet she had. That should have felt like a win. But all she could think about was Madison. Her smirk, her polished threats, wrapped in protocol and policy. Grace wasn't naive. She knew that standing up in that room could cost her everything. The door behind her opened quietly. She didn't need to turn around. Ethan's voice was calm. I thought I'd find you here. She gave a small nod, not facing him. He took a few steps closer and leaned lightly against the counter beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he asked, "Can I show you something?" Grace finally turned. Ethan was holding a manila folder, the same one from the meeting. He opened it and pulled out a few sheets of paper, laying them gently on the small round table by the window. "These," he said, "are some of the notes you've written over the last few months." Grace's brows furrowed. How did you get those?" "I found them," he said, "left behind in conference rooms, scribbled in the margins of reports, typed but never sent. You weren't hiding them, but you also weren't sharing them." She looked down at the papers, her handwriting, her words, campaign ideas, customer notes, lines she'd written just to get something off her chest. "I've been reading them since yesterday," Ethan continued. "And honestly, I'm still thinking about that line you wrote, the one about trust beginning when someone feels truly seen." He paused, then added, "That's not just marketing, that's leadership." Grace didn't know what to say. Compliments weren't something she was used to, not like that. She managed, "I just wanted to help. I wasn't trying to break any rules." "I know," he said. There was a long pause. Then he asked her something she didn't expect. "How long have you been watching us get it wrong?" Her head snapped toward him. "I'm serious," he said, voice quiet but steady. "How long have you been sitting in that corner, seeing exactly where we're losing connection, and thinking you couldn't say anything?" Grace opened her mouth, closed it, then said honestly, "Too long." He nodded, eyes still on her. "That's on us." She looked down at the coffee in her hand. The cup was almost empty now, the warmth fading. "I always thought if I just did my job really well, someone would notice," she said softly. "Turns out you can be excellent and invisible at the same time." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I lost my wife 2 years ago." The shift was so sudden, Grace wasn't sure she'd heard him right. He went on. "Car accident, out of nowhere. I didn't know how to grieve, so I worked. I built this place bigger, faster, more deals, more hours. I thought if I made the company strong enough, I wouldn't feel the cracks." Grace stayed still. She knew that kind of pain, not his, but something close. The feeling of everything solid turning into air. I forgot how to listen, Ethan said, not just to clients, to people. And then yesterday, I heard you, really heard you, and I realised how much I've been missing. His voice cracked just slightly at the edge, but he didn't look away. I don't know what comes next, he admitted, but I know one thing for sure. This place needs more of your voice, not less. Grace felt something shift inside her, like a door that had been locked for years finally creaked open. You really mean that? She asked. I do, he said, and I'd like to offer you something. She tensed. I'm not promoting you, he said quickly, raising a hand. Not yet. That would be too easy, and unfair to the others who've been chasing titles for years. Grace nodded, almost relieved. But I want you to lead something, Ethan continued. Something real. We're going to rebuild our communication strategy from the ground up, and I want you on point. Grace blinked. You want me to lead it? I want you to write it, he said. I want your voice at the centre of how we talk to our clients, how we talk to each other. You've been seeing people the whole time, I just haven't been smart enough to see you. The words landed soft but heavy. Grace had no idea what to say, so she whispered, okay. And for the first time in years, the word didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a beginning. The next few days felt like stepping into someone else's life. Grace arrived at the office a little earlier than usual, partly out of nerves, partly out of habit. But this time, something was different. Her name had been added to a new email thread. She had access to folders she'd never seen before. And that afternoon, an official message went out to the team. Grace Miller would be drafting the first round of client messaging revisions, with direct support from the company's leadership. It didn't say promotion, it didn't mention a title, but it was enough to turn heads. Some people offered warm smiles in passing, others didn't say a word but stared just a second too long. And Madison? Madison didn't say anything. Not until the following morning. Grace was at her desk reviewing past client notes when she heard the click of heels behind her. Grace, Madison said, tone casual but tight. Can we chat? Grace turned, trying to keep her expression neutral. Of course. They walked to the hallway near the copy room, one of those quiet corners where uncomfortable conversations happened. Madison crossed her arms, then smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I just wanted to say, congratulations, she said. I'm sure this new project must be very exciting for you. Grace nodded. Thank you. There was a pause. I'll admit, Madison went on, I was surprised when you were brought onto something so visible. You've always been consistent, quiet, but this is a high-stakes account. Grace said nothing. She could feel where this was going. Madison leaned in just slightly. Just be careful, she said softly. Clients like Morrison don't respond well to emotional fluff. They want experience, strategy. You only get one shot with people like that. Grace looked at her, steady. That's exactly what I'm working toward. Madison's smile tightened. Good. Then you won't mind if I stay close to the process, just to make sure everything's aligned. She walked off without waiting for an answer, her heels echoing behind her like punctuation. Back at her desk, Grace sat down slowly. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but something deeper. She knew Madison wasn't just watching, she was waiting for a mistake, for a moment of weakness, a reason to pull her back down. That afternoon, Grace found herself standing in front of the executive office on the top floor, a printed draft clutched tightly in her hand. She hadn't planned to bring it so soon, but after that hallway exchange, she needed to know if she was truly ready for this. She knocked. Ethan looked up from his desk and motioned her in. Everything all right? Grace gave a small smile. I brought the first draft. She handed him the pages and waited, stomach tied in knots. He read silently for a few minutes, eyebrows pulled slightly together, not in confusion but focus. Then he looked up. This is excellent, he said. Relief spread through her like warmth. You're not just saying that. He shook his head. Not even a little. You found a way to talk about what we do without sounding like we're trying to sell something. That's rare. Grace sat down across from him, her shoulders easing. I'm still learning, she said honestly. I've never led anything before. Ethan nodded. You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to write like you care. That's what they'll hear. She hesitated, then asked, what if Madison tries to get in the way? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Madison has a way of believing she owns every room she walks into. But that doesn't make her right, and it definitely doesn't make her untouchable. He leaned forward. This company needs to change. You're helping us do that. I trust you. Grace sat there, stunned by how simple that sentence was, and how rare it had been to hear anything like it in her life. She left his office walking a little taller. She still didn't have a title or a new office or a nameplate, but for the first time in years she had something better, belief. Not just in herself, but from someone who mattered. Still, as she passed the glass walls of the third-floor conference room, she caught a glimpse of Madison alone inside, speaking quietly into her phone. Calm, composed, still very much in control. And Grace couldn't shake the feeling. This wasn't over yet. The next morning, Grace arrived to find her inbox unusually full. There were messages from the design team, questions from legal, and a short note from someone on the operations side asking for input on phrasing. But one email stood out. The subject line read, "Revisions requested, Morrison draft." It was from Madison. Grace opened it slowly, already bracing herself. There was no greeting, just a list of bullet points, long, precise, and painfully clear. Suggestions like tone down emotional phrasing, remove the personal anecdote about the founder, and focus more on deliverables, less on sentiment. At the bottom of the message, Madison had written a single line, "Please return a revised version by 2 o'clock this afternoon so I can review before leadership sees it." Grace leaned back in her chair. This wasn't feedback, it was erasure. Madison wasn't refining the message, she was pulling out its heart. The exact thing that had made it feel real. Grace scrolled back through the original draft, her version. The one that told a story, that honoured the Morrison Group's journey, that tried to say something more than "here's what we offer." It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And now, someone who had never believed in her voice wanted to reshape it in their own image. She glanced at the time, it was 10:42 in the morning. Without thinking too hard, she picked up her phone and typed out a message to James. "Need to talk, you free around lunch?" The reply came fast. "Meet me at the park. Bring whatever's got you frowning like that." The park was just a few blocks away from the office. Nothing fancy, just a couple of benches, some patchy grass, and a food truck that smelled like grilled cheese and rosemary fries. But Grace had always liked it there. It was quiet, ordinary, uncomplicated. James was already sitting when she arrived. He held out a drink without saying a word. "I got you the iced chai," he said. "You always squint at the menu, then get the same thing." Grace smiled, settling beside him on the bench. She pulled out her laptop and opened the Morrison draft. James leaned over to read, his face thoughtful, then she showed him Madison's email. When he finished reading, he shook his head. "This is strong, Grace. Madison's edits, they suck the life right out of it." "I know," she said softly. "So what's the problem?" "She's still above me," Grace said. "And I'm not trying to start a war." James took a bite of his sandwich. "It's not a war, it's a conversation. And if you back down now, this won't be the last time she rewrites you." Grace didn't respond right away. She watched a pigeon chase another off the edge of a trash bin, then looked up at the sky. It was the kind of cloudy that couldn't make up its mind, light trying to break through. "What if I push back and I'm wrong?" she asked. "What if Ethan changes his mind?" James looked at her with something like patience and something like belief. "Then you keep writing, you build something else, but at least it'll be yours." Back at her desk, Grace sat for a while before opening a new email. She read Madison's message again, took a slow breath, then started typing. "Hi Madison, thank you for your suggestions. I understand the concern around tone, but I believe the emotional parts are what made this piece resonate in the first place. I'm happy to talk through the intention behind each section if helpful, but I'd prefer to share this version with leadership as is and gather direct feedback from them and the client team. Best, Grace." She hesitated for a second. Then she clicked send. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then her phone rang. "It was Ethan," she answered quietly. "Hello?" "I just read your response to Madison," he said. His voice was even, unreadable. Grace gripped the phone tighter, bracing herself. But then Ethan added, "Good, that's exactly the kind of leadership I've been hoping to see." Her heart exhaled all at once. "I've got your back," he said simply. And in that moment, Grace believed it. Not because he said it, but because for the first time, she believed in herself too. The email came in at 9:17 the next morning. Grace saw the subject line first, Proposal Feedback, Morrison Group. Her hands hesitated above the keyboard. She clicked. It was short, just a few lines from the Morrison team's Director of Partnerships. "This is exactly the kind of message we've been waiting for. Honest, thoughtful, and completely aligned with who we are. Please let the writer know we'd love to speak directly before finalising. Grace stared at the words. For a long moment, the world around her went quiet. The background noise of printers, footsteps, and office chatter faded out. All she could hear was the echo of her own heartbeat. They liked it. They saw her. She was still processing the email when Ethan's assistant knocked lightly on her cubicle wall. "He'd like to see you," she said with a smile. "Now." Ethan didn't say anything at first when Grace stepped into his office. He just turned his monitor toward her so she could read the message herself. After a few seconds, he leaned back in his chair and gave a slow nod. "You did it." Grace blinked. I didn't think they'd respond so quickly." "They didn't just respond," he said. "They connected." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Grace sat, still trying to steady her breath. "They want to talk with you," Ethan added. "Directly." Her eyes widened. "Me?" "You're the voice behind the message," he said simply. "It's only fair." Grace didn't know what to say. She'd written the letter late one night, thinking maybe, just maybe, it might help someone feel seen. She never imagined it would be the reason she got called into the corner office 2 days later. Ethan leaned forward. "I know this might feel fast, but you earned this, and I want the rest of the team to see that too." Grace nodded slowly. "Okay." By lunchtime, the news had spread. Whispers travelled faster than email. People were talking, some curious, some sceptical, some genuinely excited. Grace passed 2 co-workers in the break room whispering her name. One of them smiled and said, "Heard you knocked it out of the park?" She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just smiled, murmured thanks, and kept walking. Later that day, during a cross-department meeting, Ethan brought it up himself. He stood at the front of the room, holding a printed copy of Grace's letter. "This," he said, "is what happens when someone takes the time to truly listen. Not just to clients, but to people. This is what real communication looks like." He didn't call Grace to the front. He didn't make her speak. But when he looked toward the back of the room and nodded, everyone turned to see her. And for once, she didn't look away. She didn't shrink. She sat up straighter. But not everyone was smiling. Madison sat near the front, arms folded, lips pursed. She didn't clap when the others did, and she didn't stay after the meeting either. She walked out the moment it ended, phone in hand, already typing something. Grace noticed, but she didn't let it shake her. Not this time. That evening, the office was quieter than usual. Grace stayed late, not because she had to, but because she wanted the stillness, the peace of it. She sat at her desk, pulled out her old leather journal, and wrote one simple line. "I'm not invisible anymore, and maybe I never was. I just needed someone to look." She closed the book gently. Outside, the city lights blinked into life, and inside, Grace finally felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Steady. The elevator ride to the 34th floor felt longer than usual. Grace stood quietly, hands clasped in front of her. The soft hum of the elevator, the only sound between her and Ethan. He hadn't said much since they'd left his office. Just a simple "You ready?" followed by a nod when she answered yes. She wasn't sure if she was. The meeting room was already prepped when they arrived. A glass table, bottled water, a screen on the wall showing the Morrison Group logo. Grace stood near the window, watching cars move like tiny silver threads below. This wasn't her world. She was used to fluorescent lights, lukewarm coffee, and being the one who booked rooms, not sat in them. But today was different. Today she had been invited. Ethan placed a folder gently on the table, then turned to her. "You don't need to impress anyone," he said. "Just be who you were when you wrote that letter." Grace nodded, though her stomach was a tight knot. Minutes later, the Morrison team arrived, 2 men in navy suits, 1 woman in a grey blazer with reading glasses perched on her head. They introduced themselves with polite smiles and firm handshakes. Grace's hand trembled slightly, but no one seemed to notice. The conversation started with small talk, progress updates, timelines, a bit of strategic chatter. Grace took quiet notes, the way she always had. But then the woman in the grey blazer leaned forward and looked directly at her. "You're Grace, right?" she asked. Grace blinked. "Yes." "You wrote the draft we received." Grace glanced at Ethan, who gave a subtle nod. "I did," she said, her voice even. The woman smiled. It wasn't a corporate smile. It was real. "I just want to say, that letter felt like it was written by someone who actually saw us. Not just our numbers or our goals, but the people behind them." Grace felt her throat tighten. She wasn't sure what to say, so she said the truth. "I've worked in the background a long time," she began. "But over the years I've noticed something. Clients don't just want services, they want to be understood. And sometimes, It's the little things they say when no one's paying attention that matter the most. The man beside her nodded. That's exactly right. The conversation shifted after that, less formal, more personal. Grace talked more than she ever had in a meeting before, not with polish, but with sincerity. She didn't use fancy terminology or sales speak. She just spoke like someone who had listened closely and cared deeply. By the end of the meeting, the Morrison team looked genuinely relieved. "Let's move forward with this direction," one of them said. "We'll review the next round together, but we're excited." They shook hands again, this time with warmth. And as they left, the woman in the grey blazer turned back one last time. "I hope you keep writing," she said. "You have a rare gift." Grace stood still long after they were gone. Ethan walked over, a quiet pride in his expression. "You were exactly what they needed." Grace let out a soft laugh, breathless. "I didn't know I could do that." "I did," he said. Back at her desk, Grace sat down and opened her inbox, trying to settle back into her routine. But everything felt changed. She had walked into that room expecting to survive it. Instead, she'd led it. Her screen blinked, a new message. From Madison. "Would like to meet. Let me know when you have a moment." Grace stared at it for a while. Something in her gut told her this wasn't congratulations. This was the beginning of something else. She closed her laptop and exhaled slowly. Whatever came next, she wasn't hiding anymore. Grace knocked once on Madison's door. "Come in," came the voice from inside, calm, clipped, perfectly controlled like always. Madison sat behind her desk, a sleek mug of tea in one hand, the other flipping through a file she didn't look up from. Grace stood just inside the room waiting. Finally, Madison set the file down and looked at her. "I wanted to speak briefly before this goes any further," she said. "This new visibility you've gained, it's delicate, temporary even." Grace didn't answer right away. Madison continued, "One good meeting doesn't make you a leader. There's a lot more to this job than writing something people feel good about." Grace nodded slowly. "You're right." That seemed to catch Madison off guard. "But," Grace added gently, "writing something people feel good about was the part we'd forgotten. And it turns out, it mattered." Madison's jaw tightened. "You went around me." "I spoke up," Grace said calmly, "for once." Madison leaned back in her chair, expression unreadable. "You're not qualified, no formal background, no leadership experience." Grace nodded again. "I used to believe that too." There was a beat of silence. Then Grace said, "I don't need your approval, Madison. I came here to thank you." That made Madison blink. "Excuse me?" "You taught me what it feels like to be invisible," Grace said. "And now that I'm not, I'll never let anyone else feel that way on my watch." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply turned, walked out, and closed the door behind her with a quiet confidence she hadn't even known she possessed a month ago. Later that afternoon, Ethan called her into his office. She thought it might be about the follow-up with Morrison Group, or another round of feedback. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the city below, and said, "You've changed things." Grace smiled faintly. "Not alone." "But you started it," he said. He turned toward her. "I want you to officially take over client messaging, not just for Morrison, but all of it." Grace's eyes widened. "That's a big ask." "You've already been doing it," Ethan said. "Now I'm just making it official." He walked over to his desk, picked up a thin folder, and handed it to her. Inside was a formal offer. Title: Director of Client Communication Strategy. Grace stared at it. It wasn't just the job, it was everything it stood for. "I don't have a fancy degree," she said quietly. "I still doubt myself more than I should." Ethan nodded. "And yet, here you are." Grace closed the folder, her voice soft but steady. "Okay." He smiled. "Good." As she turned to leave, he added, "There's one more thing." She looked back. "I heard about your meeting with Madison." Grace arched an eyebrow. "You did? She said you were firm." Grace smiled. "I was clear." Ethan nodded, visibly amused. "You keep being clear." Boom. That evening, Grace took the long way home. She walked past the bookstore where she used to hide on weekends, the coffee shop that always got her name wrong, the park bench where she'd once eaten lunch alone, wondering if her words would ever matter to anyone. Now she knew they did. And not just to clients, to herself. She unlocked the door to her apartment, set her bag down, and pulled out her journal. Same old leather cover, edges worn from years of holding things she never said out loud. She flipped to a fresh page, and she wrote, "Today I didn't shrink to fit the room. I stood tall, I filled the space. And for once, it felt like it had been waiting for me." She closed the journal gently and exhaled, not with fear, with peace. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stop shrinking. To stop apologising for taking up space. To stop waiting for permission to speak, to lead, to matter. Grace didn't become someone else. She just finally had the courage to become who she truly was. And maybe that's the real story here, that we are not invisible. We're just waiting for the right moment and the right voice inside us to say you belong here. So if you've ever felt overlooked, unheard or unseen, let this be your reminder. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to believe your voice deserves to be heard. And trust me, someone out there is waiting to listen. Thank you so much for staying with us until this very moment. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the little bell so you never miss a moment like this again. Your presence here means more than you know. Once again, this is Rain Inside, and we can't wait to see you next time. Until then, stay kind, stay gentle, and stay true to who you are.